Near the center of every great story is a great conflict, a great war. Two soldiers, each with a gift for storytelling.
Well, good evening, everybody. Woo! No homework or anything tonight? Just kidding. So glad you're here. Welcome to the President's Lecture Series. On November 11th of this next month, very important day, it's commemorated each year, but this year it's particularly important. It's called Armistice Day. It's a day that commemorates the end of hostilities during World War I between Germany and the Allied nations. World War I often gets eclipsed in our minds by World War II, but World War I has been called the central event of modern times, the most traumatic, some have called it the most traumatic event in the history of Western civilization since the fall of the Roman Empire. The first modern war, the bloodiest war in history, many infamous names, but it's a very significant event. And when I saw the cover of this book, called A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, World War I thought, this really looks interesting. I've got to read this book. And I did, and it was fascinating, and I thought, is there any way to bring the author to campus? And we're very grateful that he is here tonight to speak to us. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Joseph Loconte is an associate professor of history at the King's College in New York City, where he teaches courses on Western civilization, American foreign policy, and international human rights. He is an author. It's not his latest book, but it's fairly recent. The book that I just showed you was on the New York Times bestseller list. He has previously served as distinguished visiting professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, where he taught religion and public policy. He was a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He held the first chair in religion and civil society as the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's written books, God, Locke, and Liberty, The Struggle for Religious Freedom in the West. Another one, The Searchers, A Quest for Faith in the Valley of Doubt. Another one, The End of Illusion, Religious Leaders Confronting Hitler's Gathering Storm. Dr. Loconte comments on religion and public life, and his comments appear in leading media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the National Interest, the Weekly Standard, National Review, the London-based Standpoint, and the Huffington Post. For 10 years, he served as a commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. Dr. Loconte has testified before Congress on international human rights and served as a human rights expert on the 2005 Congressional Task Force on the United Nations. He also has served as an informal advisor to the White House, its faith-based community initiatives. He has more recently been a speechwriter for British Member of Parliament Andrew Mitchell, Shadow Secretary of the State for International Development, and now serves as a senior fellow at Trinity Forum and an affiliated scholar for the John Jay Institute. He's a native of Brooklyn, New York, and we asked him to come, and his title tonight is War, Friendship, and Imagination, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the Crisis of the Modern Age. So would you give a great CCU welcome to Dr. Joseph Loconte.
Thank you, Don. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Don. Can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats? How's the volume level? How's the pitch and all that? And also to our friends in the auxiliary seating, just want to say hello to them. Hope they can all hear me well. Guys, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's amazing what an extra credit assignment can do to fill a room. I love it. Yeah. Well, it's Tolkien and Lewis, of course, that have drawn us here tonight. It sure ain't Loconte, it's Tolkien and Lewis. And, I come from an Italian-American family from Brooklyn. We're not in Brooklyn right now, are we here, ladies and gentlemen? And I called my sister up this morning, my dear sister, my best friend in life. And as my Aunt Carmela would say, we're from the same box of spaghetti. Same box of spaghetti. And it was her birthday today, so I called her up, wished her happy birthday. And she's very impish, my sister. She says to me, okay, Joe, good luck on the talk tonight. If they throw tomatoes, it's not a problem. You can just go home and make a nice red sauce, spaghetti sauce. Thank you, Sue. I love you, too. And, it's great to be back here at Colorado Christian University. I was here several years ago before this room, this space even existed. and it's great to be back. And I have to tell you, as an Italian-American from Brooklyn, you don't always get invited back. Let me just tell you a little story if I could, so stop the clock for a minute here. I'm at a birthday party from my dad's brother, Vito, Uncle Vito. There are several Uncle Vitos in the family, just for your information. So I'm sitting across the table from Uncle Gus, Gustare. He's like right off the boat. He speaks English, but it's very broken English, heavy Italian accent. So we start talking Italian politics, of course. And if you know anything about Italian politics, they don't really have a government for very long. It lasts 6 months, 10 months, a year, and that's it. It just collapses. So I'm Uncle Gus, what's with the Italians? Why can't they get a government and stick with it? He gets very serious, leans across the table, and he says, Giuseppe, you have to understand what it means to be an Italian. Ladies and gentlemen, you can imagine at this existential moment, I am all ears. You have to understand what it means to be an Italian. In Italy, if we don't like you, we get rid of you. So it's nice to be back, that's all I'm saying. It's nice to be invited back. That's all I'm saying. Great to be here. All right, let's get into it. Beginning at about 7 a.m., July 1st, 1916, the British Army unleashes what can only be called a hellish assault against German positions on the Western Front in France along the River Somme. The roar of the guns is so loud that it's heard in London, nearly 200 miles away. This barrage, about 3,500 shells a minute, is designed to obliterate the deepest dugouts, severely compromise the German artillery, the machine gun power, crossing no man's land, which is that dreadful death zone stretching between the opposing enemy trenches. Crossing that zone, the soldiers are told, it'll be a song, a stroll to the park. Well, 7:30 on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, nearly 100,000 British troops, to the sound of whistles, drums, and bagpipes, climb out of their trenches and attack. Like other great battles, this one was supposed to break the back of the German army, hasten the end of the war. But the Germans have endured the pounding, and they're waiting, guns poised for the British infantry. We didn't have to aim, said a German machine gunner. We just fired into them. So before the day is over, 19,420 British soldiers lay dead, nearly twice that number wounded. Most killed in the first hour of the attack, many within the first minutes. So July 1st, 1916 marks the deadliest single day in British military history. And that's a lot of history, isn't it? Sir Frank Fox, the regimental historian, he put it this way: in that field of fire, nothing could live. And so the Battle of the Somme, which was so typical of the battles fought during the First World War, it'll rage on inconclusively for 5 months, dragging over 1 million men into its vortex of suffering and death. Well, 24-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien, a second lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force, is among their number. He's there. Tolkien spends several months in the trenches in the Somme Valley, often under intense enemy fire. In the midst of war now, with the threat of death all around him, it is here, Tolkien says, that he began writing the early parts of his mythology about Middle-earth. At lectures in cold fogs, he says, or by candlelight in bell tents, even some down in dugouts under shell fire. It's here that he composes the fall of Gondolin, the tale of how the elven city of Gondolin is betrayed into the hands of Morgoth. Tolkien called this, quote, the first real story of his imaginary world. He's talking about Middle-earth. He is laying a foundation for his great epic work in the midst of this war. Well, while he's doing that, while Tolkien is enduring the horror of the trenches, another young man with a gift for storytelling, is hoping he can avoid the conflict altogether. Clive Staples Lewis is standing on a train platform at the Great Bookham train station there in England in March 1916, and he's trying to put the war out of his mind. He's not yet 18 years old, but C.S. Lewis knows his deployment to the front is inevitable. Lewis has been studying the classics under a tutor before applying to Oxford, and he's reaching for authors now who can nourish a growing taste for fantasy and romance. William Morris, John Keats, Percy Shelley. Lewis walks over to a bookstall at the train station platform. They're selling books. He buys a copy of Phantastes, this mythic romance by the Scottish Christian author George MacDonald. And as he absorbs the book during his train ride, Lewis senses in this book a kind of hopeful, spiritual quality that he has encountered almost nowhere else. Let me just read you a few lines from MacDonald's Phantastes, lines that Lewis must have read on that train ride. Soon I fell asleep, overcome with fatigue and delight, in dreams of unspeakable joy, of restored friendships, of revived embraces, of love which said it had never died, of faces that had vanished long ago, yet said with smiling lips that they knew nothing of the grave, of pardons implored and granted with such bursting floods of love that I was almost glad that I'd sinned. Thus I passed through this wondrous twilight. I awoke with the feeling that I'd been kissed and loved to my heart's content. Wow. Lewis explained the effect that this had on him. A few hours later, he said, I knew that I had crossed a great frontier. Reaching unexpectedly into his imagination, MacDonald's book challenges Lewis's deepening atheism. He's an atheist now as he's reading MacDonald as the war starts, but he's being challenged. And ultimately, MacDonald's book will help to make plausible for Lewis the Christian account of the human predicament. Well, like Tolkien, Lewis finds himself in a combat regiment on the Western Front. He arrives in France as a second lieutenant, November 1917, on his 19th birthday. How many out here are 19 years old right now? Just show of hands. Well, happy birthday. See you on the front. Terrific. After 5 months at the front, Lewis has had enough of war. Here's how he describes it: the frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles. Both of these men, Tolkien and Lewis, they survived the First World War. Tolkien contracts trench fever. He's sent home to a hospital in England to recover. Lewis is severely injured by a mortar attack that kills his sergeant, obliterates his sergeant standing close to him. Lewis is sent to a hospital in London to recover from his wounds. Lewis and Tolkien meet for the first time in 1926 at Oxford, both as instructors in English literature. And almost immediately, a bond of friendship is formed between these two men that will transform their lives and their literary careers. They will use their personal experience of combat to inform their Christian imagination. They'll enlist the hardships of war as a kind of crucible for moral and spiritual growth. And together, these two men, they will retrieve the concept of the epic and mythic hero and reinvent him for the modern mind. Tolkien, of course, creates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, one of the best-selling novels ever written, among the most influential books of the 20th century by all the polls. Lewis earns fame for books like Mere Christianity, The Screwtape Letters, The Chronicles of Narnia, that series of children's books that has sold well over 100 million copies and is ranked among the classics. Not bad. It could be argued, though, that these tales of a conflict between light and darkness, they might never have been written had these authors not been flung into the furnace of combat. Their shared experience of the sorrows and the triumphs of war helps to bring them together in friendship. Their common moral vision, their lifelong collaboration makes possible their great creative works. War, friendship, and imagination. That's the big picture. Now, let's try to unpack it. War, friendship, and imagination. I don't think we can really appreciate the achievement of Tolkien and Lewis unless we understand something about the historical context, the times in which they live, the catastrophic effects of the First World War on world civilization, the crisis of the West after the First World War. As Don mentioned, in just a few weeks now, November 11th, 2018, we're going to mark the centennial of the end of the First World War. After 4 years of mechanized slaughter, 20 million people are dead, soldiers and civilians, another at least 21 million wounded. Before it's all over, nearly every family in Europe is grieving the loss of a family member, or helping others to grieve, or caring for a wounded soldier struggling to adjust to civilian life. Listen to Winston Churchill on this. All of the horrors of all of the ages were brought together, he says, and not only armies, but whole populations were thrust into the midst of them. So what does the war produce? National economies are ruined. Entire empires have collapsed. The war to make the world safe for democracy has left the European democracies battered and bankrupt. Like no other force in history, friends, this war damages the mental and the moral outlook of European society. It instigates a season of cynicism and agnosticism toward the ideals and the institutions of Western civilization. Listen to historian Richard Overy on this. For the generation living after the end of the First World War, the prospect of imminent crisis, a new dark age, became a habitual way of looking at the world. Let me underscore that from Overy. Imminent crisis, a new dark age? That's how people are thinking? Barbara Tuchman, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Guns of August, put it this way. When at last it was over, the war had many diverse results, and one dominant one transcending all others: disillusion. Disillusion. Anybody here ever been disillusioned about something in life? Something that you've been deeply disappointed about? You had high hopes and it came crashing down. Disillusionment. The post-war generation experiences this in a major way, and it takes an outlet. It finds an outlet in literature, the arts, philosophy, science, politics, and religion. Let me just read you a few titles, book titles. Some of these books are on my shelf at home, back there in Washington, D.C., in the swamp. I've escaped the swamp to be with you people. I bring good tidings. Here are some titles on my bookshelves. 1920, The End of the World. You guys just been through midterms now, right? Feeling like the end of the world, kind of. 1920, The End of the World. Social Decay and Degeneration in 1921. Spengler's The Decline of the West, 1922. The Decay of Capitalist Civilization, 1923. The Twilight of the White Races in 26. Will Civilization Crash, 1927. The Problem of Decadence, 1931. And one of my personal favorites, W.H. Auden's The Dance of Death. How about that for a Loconte Book of the Month Club? The Dance of Death. Come on in, free coffee and donuts. Well, you get the sense of things, right? You get the mood. This war helped to create a kind of spiritual crisis, right? A spiritual malaise. To many of the best and brightest, Christianity now seems to lack any explanatory power. It can't answer for its role in the remorseless violence unleashed by these supposedly Christian nations of Europe, what they did to each other. The church appears to offer little help for those thousands of shell-shocked veterans, either institutionalized or literally wandering the streets of Europe, unable to cope with the trauma of war. Freudian psychology, which views religious belief as kind of a delusion, seems more in touch to many people with human personality than Christianity. So there's a new skepticism in the air. That's the point. A new skepticism after the war. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. You guys read The Wasteland yet? Here at CCU? Not yet? Okay. That happy poem is coming your way, The Wasteland. perhaps coming your way. He wrote The Wasteland, but he became a Christian. Baptized in the Church of England, 1927. And when that happened, one of his friends, Virginia Woolf, she was a member of a literary set in London. Eliot was a part of that set, and then he becomes a Christian. And Virginia Woolf can't believe what's happened. Here's what she writes to a friend, talking about T.S. Eliot. I've had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. Sounds like an Italian from southern Italy over there. Dead to us all now. You're dead to me, Tom Eliot. And she goes on. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God. That's Virginia Woolf on Tom Eliot in 1927. That's what these guys are up against, Lewis and Tolkien. So nature abhors a vacuum, and the Great War seems to confirm the fatal weaknesses of liberal democracy and biblical religion. And so now the door is just thrust open. It's open now to all kinds of secular substitutes. Let's just take the new science. Oh, we got a little off track here. Hang on a second. Oh, Connie, here we go. The new science of eugenics. Eugenics. This is one of the most striking effects of the war, an acute anxiety in the 1920s, especially in educated circles, friends, that something is profoundly wrong with the racial stock of Western civilization, a sickness in the racial body. The promotion of eugenics, that's from the Latin phrase, good birth, good birth. This thing had begun in Great Britain just before the war, but now it's just taken off like gangbusters. Listen to Francis Galton, a British sociologist who coined the term. I think I've got his quote here if you can read it. Yeah, okay. Listen to Galton here. Eugenics must be introduced into the national conscience like a new religion. It has indeed strong claims to become an orthodox religious tenet of the future. For eugenics cooperates with the workings of nature by ensuring that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. What nature does blindly, slowly, ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. Well, eugenics will gain international support and scientific respectability in the period between the two world wars, just as Lewis and Tolkien are establishing their academic careers. What's the aim of that movement, people? Shorthand version of it? Use the tools of science and public policy to improve the human gene pool. How? Immigration laws, marriage laws, birth control, and forced sterilization. Forced sterilization to weed out the unfit. Well, Benito Mussolini, who sweeps into power in Italy in 1922, is the first European leader. He's the first to exploit the language of eugenics to establish his fascist regime. Science and government will work together to improve the Italian race. That's the plan. I should just say that my maternal grandfather, Giuseppe Aiello, Joseph, for whom I'm named, Giuseppe Aiello, he left his island home of Ventotene off the coast of Naples in 1921, a year before Mussolini came into power. Molto grazie, mio nonno, bravo. Thank you, Grandpa, well done. And I love this shot of Mussolini, you know. He's just, what a guy, what a guy. What a guy. Mussolini. All right. One of Mussolini's earliest admirers, of course, is Adolf Hitler. Nazism, according to Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, was applied biology. That's what Nazism is. Hitler's Aryan race was the eugenic ideal, and maintaining its purity became the focus of national policy. So, what's the point? Fascism, Nazism, communism, scientism, eugenics. These, friends, are the revolutions and the ideologies that are now sweeping the European continent in the 1920s and 30s. Why? Because of the exhaustion of the Western democracies coming out of the war. All of these ideologies, political ideology, they all have a vision for perfecting human nature. And yet all of them launch an assault on nature itself. All begin by promising liberation from oppression, all become instruments of totalitarian control. And this makes the literary aims of Tolkien and Lewis profoundly counter-cultural, even subversive. Let me underscore that. The cultural objectives of Tolkien and Lewis were deeply countercultural, subversive in their day, and I think even in our day. They are vigorously going to reject these schemes, these utopian schemes. And their rejection is on display in the way each of their stories elevates what? The individual. The individual and individual responsibility in response to a great crisis. Think again for a minute, the First World War. Like no previous war, it assaulted the individual. It degraded the belief in individual virtue, individual valor, and heroism. The helplessness of the individual soldier, ravaged by the tools of modern industrial societies, is a recurring theme in the post-war world. In his blockbuster novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, Eric Remarque predicted a generation of war veterans broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. The literary critic Roger Sale has called the First World War, quote, the single event most responsible for shaping the modern idea that heroism is dead. Let me underscore that. Sale thinks that the war was the event most responsible for giving this idea that heroism is dead. Tolkien and Lewis openly rebel against that outlook. And the key to understanding the moral universe of Narnia and Middle-earth and the role of the individual in that universe, well, it could be found in a scene from The Lord of the Rings. We see it in Aragorn, his answer to Eomer, who asks how they ought to respond to this storm of evil that's thrust upon them. And what Aragorn says, good and evil have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and dwarves and another among men. It is a man's part to discern them. What's he saying? A universal moral law to which everyone is accountable. And it's the same vision that animates the Chronicles of Narnia. All of the various creatures, the bears and the badgers, the moles and the mice, right along with the English children, they are all summoned to help rescue Narnia from a new despotism and restore its rightful line of kings. Listen to Jill in the Chronicles. I'd rather be killed fighting for Narnia, she says, than grow old and stupid at home and perhaps go about in a bath chair and then die in the end just the same. In Narnia and Middle-earth, every person is caught up in a great moral contest. And the choices of every person in this contest matter supremely. Let me underscore the point again. Remember what the soldiers at the Western Front were made to endure. The mortars, the machine guns, the tanks, the poison gas, the flamethrowers, the barbed wire, the trench warfare. Never before had science and technology so conspired to obliterate both man and nature. On average, think about this number. It's the only number I'm going to throw at you now. About 6,046 men, soldiers, were killed every day of the war. 6,046 every day. How many students here at CCU, population? How many? Total? 8,000, okay. So, about 2/3 just gone. College population gone in a single day. And it goes on day after day after day for 4 years. That's what they're facing. That's what they're facing. The mutilated remains of millions of men are just consigned to graves scattered across Europe. And for what? For what, they're asking. What difference did individuals make in the face of that? That's the mood of the hour. Individuals don't matter. Tolkien and Lewis, they reject this attitude. In the worlds they create, everyone has a role to play in an epic battle between light and darkness. And the moral and spiritual growth of their characters depends on what? Their individual choices. Listen to Tolkien. Such is the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world, he says. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. In Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, we follow the adventures, of course, of the Baggins children as they become part of a great war for the kingdom of Narnia against the White Witch and the forces of evil. Remember Lucy in Prince Caspian? There's that moment of crisis when the outcome of the war is hanging in the balance. And this little girl is asked to do something that's difficult for her, something that could be costly, something she doesn't want to do. She has to decide if she'll put away her fears and obey Aslan. She has to decide. I mustn't think about it. I must just do it. She could feel lion strength going into her. Now you are a lioness, Aslan says, and now all Narnia will be renewed. Remember that scene in The Horse and His Boy? When Shasta and Aravis, helped by the talking horses, they race across the desert to warn Narnia of the approaching army of Rabadash, bent on its destruction. But before reaching their goal, they're attacked by a lion. Aravis, further behind, is moments from being cut down by the beast. Shasta now has a choice to make. Stop, bellowed Shasta in Bree's ear. Must go back, must help. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrup, slid both his legs over the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him. But before he knew how it hurt him, he was staggering back to help Aravis. Friends, scenes like that would have been very familiar to the many veterans of the Great War. The image of the soldier throwing himself into harm's way to rescue a fallen comrade. In the conflict between the White Witch and Narnia, between Mordor and Middle-earth, every soul is tested. Every creature must choose sides. Moral indifference is just not an option. The vital thing here is to remain faithful to the quest, regardless of the cost and the perils. Ah, Frodo. Got any Frodo fans out there? Frodo? Thank you for not wearing your hobbit ears tonight. Thank you. Frodo. In The Lord of the Rings, the mission of Frodo Baggins, of course, is to carry the ring of power, to the fires of Mount Doom and destroy it before it can destroy him. I am not made for perilous quests, Frodo exclaims. Why was I chosen? You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, says Gandalf, not for power or wisdom at any rate, but you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have. Here again, friends, Tolkien's experience at the Somme worked on his imagination. Where did Tolkien get the idea for his hobbits in the first place? After he became a professor at Oxford University, he's sitting and grading papers. Now, we got some professors out here, got some teachers out here. How many of you regularly are grading student papers? Just put your hands up, instructors here, hands up, keep them up for a minute. Keep your hands up and tell me, how many of you really enjoy grading student papers? You're lying back there, you're lying. No, you probably do. You're better instructors than I am. Tolkien is getting weary of grading papers. He finds a blank sheet in all the papers that he's grading. Finds a blank sheet. And he scrawls on the blank sheet these words. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Later on, he reflects, eventually, I thought I better find out what hobbits are like. Well, we know what hobbits are like, don't we? Listen to Tolkien. I've always been impressed that we're here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds, he says. The hobbits were made small, he explains, to show up in creatures of very small physical power, the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch. What's he talking about? He's talking about the men he fought alongside in the trenches in France. They were not, for the most part, a professional army. They were citizen soldiers, shopkeepers, bartenders, doctors, farmers, fishermen. Listen to Tolkien. My Sam Gamgee, he says, is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates that I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so far superior to myself. Think about it. One of the most beloved characters in fiction, The Hobbit, is based on what? The ordinary English soldier at his post, doing his duty, regardless of the costs. So this is part of the raw material for much of their moral imagination, these guys. The value of every person, even the weakest and the smallest. Let's add a second element. Born out of their historical experience. The Nietzschean will to power. The rise of the totalitarian state. It is no accident that both men compose their epic stories under the shadow of a Second World War. You guys know the opening lines of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? You can probably quote it. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country. So what's happening here? These children leave one world, which is being torn apart by a vicious war, only to enter another world being torn apart by war. C.S. Lewis's life, it's framed by war, if you think about it. He shared his Oxford home with his older brother Warren, also a combat veteran, and they opened up their home to English refugee children throughout the Second World War. They just kept staying with them. July 21st, 1940, during a sermon at a church service at the Holy Trinity Church at Oxford, C.S. Lewis is delivering a sermon, invited to give a talk during the war. He's there listening to a sermon, not delivering it. He's listening to a sermon, and during the sermon, his mind begins to wander. Ever happen to anybody out there? Your mind just kind of like right now, kind of like mind's wandering. And it wanders to Satan. He's in church, and his mind starts to wander to Satan. Satan's messing with his microphone over here. Why? Why in the world is he thinking about Satan in church? What's going on? Well, maybe because at this very moment, Britain is at war with Germany. Maybe because Lewis had listened to one of Hitler's speeches broadcast on the BBC, translated into English, the previous Friday, just a couple of days before. He hears Hitler for the first time, translated. And what does he hear? He hears a man hell-bent on the subjugation and the dehumanization of other races, determined to dominate not only his own country, but an entire continent. Here in this person is the will to power, unconstrained by law, custom, or conscience. Here is a man waging a war against civilization itself. So what does this do for Lewis? Well, the idea for a book comes into his mind. In church. A book made up of the secret correspondence between 2 demons. A work that exposes the strategies of the devil to draw us into his diabolical net. That book will be known as the Screwtape Letters. Now considered a classic, a masterpiece of modern satire. And it's conceived by a man in church at his prayers under the shadow of another great war. And it's no coincidence either, friends, that Tolkien, he began writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937, continued working on it throughout the Second World War, just as the fascist ideologies are dominating international politics. Mussolini invades Ethiopia in 1936, bringing his fascist policies with him. 1937, Hitler tears up the Versailles Treaty. He's out. Mussolini pulls out of the League of Nations. 1938, Germany absorbs Austria, orchestrates the Munich Agreement, absorbs a big chunk of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace. In the same year, 1938, Jews across Germany are violently assaulted during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. So the logic of eugenics and its link to the totalitarian state. Tolkien denied that his work was allegorical. It's not an allegory, but he does acknowledge in a 1938 letter, which I just came across recently, sends shivers of joy up the historian's spine in that letter to his publisher. Now he's writing his new story, the sequel to The Hobbit. And here's what he says. He says, it's becoming more terrifying than The Hobbit. The darkness of the present days has had some effect on it. Well, one of the narrative threads of The Lord of the Rings, it could be read as a conscious assault on the entire racist totalitarian project. The seductive desire for power, the desire to dominate others is a recurring theme, isn't it? Virtually no character in their stories, Tolkien or Lewis, almost no character is immune to the temptation to the will to power. We see it in Edmund, right? In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He becomes a pawn of the White Witch. Now why? How does that happen? Why does Edmund become a pawn of the White Witch? Anybody? Turkish Delight. Turkish Delight. Do they serve Turkish Delight here on the campus on a regular basis? Just out of curiosity. Good. I'm kidding. Yes, that's part of the answer. It's not just Turkish Delight, though. A desire to dominate his siblings. He wants to lord it over his siblings. That's the other reason embedded in the story. In Prince Caspian, Nickabrick, initially a foot soldier in the fight for Narnia, turns traitor when Aslan, the great lion, fails to come to their aid when they call him. Nickabrick makes the appalling suggestion that his comrades now should enlist the help of the White Witch. We want power, he says, and we want a power that will be on our side. Well, in Tolkien's story, we learn that Saruman, this wizard, originally committed to helping Middle-earth in the struggle against Mordor. Originally, Saruman, he's fallen under the sway of the Ring of Power, right? Prudence, he argues, demands a temporary compromise with Sauron, the Dark Lord. We can bide our time, he says. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Sounds like Washington, D.C. to me, baby. Even a more noble character, like Boromir, falls prey to the temptation. He disagrees with the decision at the Council of Elrond to destroy the ring. He confronts Frodo as he begins his quest. Listen to Boromir. True-hearted men will not be corrupted. We don't desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength in a just cause. By turning on Frodo and forcing him to flee, Boromir breaks the fellowship and endangers them all. Think about this. Tolkien and Lewis are often accused by their critics of escapism. Escapism, fantasy, an attempt to escape the unpleasant realities of modern life. Escapism? Really? Here are naked facts about the human condition. Because The Lord of the Rings was published in the early 1950s. Tolkien worked on it for years. Publishes in the 1950s. During the atomic age. Dropped the bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now we got the hydrogen bomb, atomic age. Many people assume that the ring is an allegorical warning against the horror of nuclear weapons. Tolkien sets them straight. Of course my story is not an allegory of atomic power, he says, but of power exerted for domination. I love it when authors tell you what this story is about. Power exerted for domination. Escapism? Here is a bitter and brutal realism about our mortal lives. So, Tolkien and Lewis share this fundamental moral vision. The idea that the choices of every person truly matter, that the lust for power is a permanent feature of human life, and that we have to do battle against it. Now, let's add another element to their story. How do we battle against the will to power? How? Tolkien and Lewis proclaim the central importance of friendship. Friendship in our common struggle against evil. We can't do this thing alone. Their personal knowledge of the fellowship of men under fire, it has to rank as another defining experience of their literary lives. Listen to John Keegan, the great British historian, war historian, his book on the First World War. Men whom the trenches cast into intimacy entered into bonds of mutual dependency and sacrifice of self stronger than any of the friendships made in peacetime. That's the ultimate mystery of the First World War, Keegan says. If we could understand its loves as well as its hates, we'd be nearer to understanding the mystery of human life. Both of these men formed some of the most important friendships of their lives under the shadow of war. For C.S. Lewis, one of those friendships was with a guy named Lawrence Johnson. 20-year-old recruit, he met him at Oxford. They fought alongside in a regiment in France. And they shared a love for literature and philosophy. They both enjoyed debating the big questions about God and morality. And now they're thrust into combat together, and yet they found time to talk during the lulls in the fighting. Can you just see C.S. Lewis? There's a temporary lull in the bombing, and he and Johnson just go at it debating about God in the trenches. Lewis called this guy Johnson, quote, a man of conscience. A man of conscience, a man with a moral code who caused him to rethink his atheism, his materialism. Here's what he said about Johnson. I had hardly till now encountered principles in anyone so nearly my own age. The alarming thing was that he took them for granted. It crossed my mind for the first time, Lewis says, for the first time since my apostasy, since I left the faith, that the severer virtues might have some relevance to one's own life. And then reflecting years later, Lewis says that Johnson, quote, he would have been a lifelong friend if he'd not been killed. He was moving toward theism. Johnson wasn't even a Christian. He was moving toward theism, and we had endless arguments, Lewis says, on that and every other topic whenever we were out of the line. What's that sound like? Sounds to me like the hound of heaven chasing this guy, chasing Lewis in the trenches through those relationships. Well, Lewis lost nearly all of his closest friends in the First World War. Nightmares of the conflict, he said, invaded my dreams for years. And yet the theme of friendship, it just pulses through the Narnia stories, doesn't it? It's like a force of nature. It might even be said that friendship replaces romance as the preeminent expression of love in Lewis's stories. It flourishes among the children, right? Between the children and the noble Narnians, between Aslan and all who serve him in love and obedience. In The Horse and His Boy, we watched that unlikely friendship emerge, right, between Aravis and Shasta, as the demands of war force them to work together, and slowly their resentments are replaced by a deep admiration and eventually love. Listen to Lewis. In his idea of Aravis, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud and could be hard enough, but she was true as steel and would never have deserted a companion whether she liked him or not. The loyalty of friendship in wartime. This quality, ladies and gentlemen, is on magnificent display in Tolkien's life and in his creative works. All of Tolkien's closest boyhood friends, this tightly knit group of aspiring poets, authors, academics, they all enlist for combat at about the same time, 1916, go off to war together. These were men he knew at the King Edward School in Birmingham. His band of brothers, Christopher Wiseman, Geoffrey Smith, Robert Gilson. In 1916, just before they go off into the theater of war, they all gather at Wiseman's flat in London, his apartment, and they talk late into the night. And they share their deepest hopes and dreams for the future. Just imagine the setting before you go off to war with your closest friends. It's during this time, with these men in this place, that Tolkien says he began to get a sense of his life's calling as a scholar, as a writer. And like Lewis, most of Tolkien's inner circle, they died. They died. They perished in the fighting along the Western Front. Rob Gilson, a member of that circle, he died on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. He bravely led his regiment in a doomed assault on a German dugout, and Tolkien felt the loss deeply. Here's a letter he wrote to one of his other friends in battle when he got the news of his friend's death. I don't know what is to be our next move or what is in store, he writes. I wish I could know where you are. So he's there on his own. One friend is dead. He doesn't know where the others are. And he's anxious. Of course he's anxious. And what does that bring to mind? It brings to my mind that scene in The Lord of the Rings when Merry finds himself cut off from his companions, facing great danger? Listen to Tolkien. Everyone he cared for had gone away into the gloom that hung over the distant eastern sky, and little hope at all was left in his heart that he would ever see any of them again. This experience of loss created in Tolkien, according to his children, a lifelong sadness. And yet, he doesn't allow it to overwhelm him. He gives it an outlet. Is it surprising that the cords of friendship, tested and strengthened amid the suffering of war, it's one of the great themes of The Lord of the Rings, right? It's why we love it. Those hobbits. Frodo and company make up the fellowship of the ring, the fellowship. When Frodo arrives at Crick Hollow, remember this scene? Before setting out for the Old Forest. He's determined to leave on his own, right? He doesn't want to expose his companions to the perils that lie ahead. But Merry, Pippin, and Sam, they all get wise to his plans, and they confront him before he can slip away. They insist on coming with him. Frodo, deeply moved, nevertheless protests. But it does not seem that I can trust anyone. Merry is unflappable. It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We're your friends, Frodo. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we're coming with you, or we're following you like hounds. Ladies and gentlemen, we all need a few people in our lives, and now's a good time to start. Make some friends who will follow you through life like hounds. They will help you. They will help you. Well, the friendship between Sam Gamgee and Frodo Baggins, this is one of the great triumphs of the work, isn't it? Remember, we're at the threshold of Mount Doom, near the end of the quest? They're weak from thirst and exhaustion. They're nearly overwhelmed by the desolation of the landscape, the lack of any living thing, the black skies, the noxious fumes, the ash and slag and burned stone, the smell of death. It's like New York City on a good day, kids. Just kidding, just kidding. Sort of just kidding. You got to ride that subway, baby. It's the Walking Dead on that subway, let me tell you. As Tolkien himself admitted, in his mind, this scene, it resembled the landscape of the battlefields in France. Well, they staggered toward their goal. Frodo, weakened by the great burden of carrying the ring, begins to crawl in his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. I said I'd carry him if it broke my back, he muttered, and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo, he cried. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and it as well. So up you get. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go, and he'll go. It's a pretty good bet, ladies and gentlemen, that only men who knew friendship of this kind, who experienced it in the field of combat, could write passages of such grit and courage and nobility. Well, caught up in youth, in the catastrophe of war, Tolkien and Lewis, they could never forget the war's sorrows. But they don't succumb to its despair, as so many men and women did in the post-war years. I think the friendship that they deliberately pursued with one another, these guys, over the course of their lives, was a huge part of the reason. It's a relationship born out of adversity, the tragedy of war. And out of their relationship comes something profoundly creative and ennobling: war, friendship, and imagination. Listen to Tolkien. Most gracious host, it was said to me by Elrond half-elven that I should find friendship upon the way, secret and unlooked for, Frodo says to Faramir. Certainly I have looked for no such friendship as you have shown. To have found it turns evil to great good. Lewis and Tolkien turned evil to great good. After the war, they seek to recapture something like that intense comradeship that sustained them during the crisis years of 1914, 1918. So, at Oxford, they launched the Inklings, those who dabble in ink, the group of friends and fellow scholars who meet weekly to read and to discuss their work together, these guys. They gather every Tuesday at the Eagle and Child for a pint or two. I know it's a dry campus, so we'll keep that in mind, all right? And every Thursday evening in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. They meet for the better part of 20 years, and I'm not exaggerating, 16, 17, 18 years, every Thursday in Lewis's rooms to read aloud works that they're working on. Critique it. How'd you like to be in that circle? Read something you've written today and have Tolkien or Lewis critique it. That's what they're doing on Thursday nights. Here's how Lewis put it. Theoretically, to talk about literature, Lewis explains, but in fact, nearly always to talk about something better. Well, they also take walking tours together in the English countryside. Walking tours. Tolkien once complained that Lewis kept up a pace as if he were a drill sergeant. It's this community of friends that Lewis has in mind when he writes those unforgettable words in his book, The Four Loves, the chapter on friendship. Something happens, Lewis says, when the whole group is together, each bringing out all that is best, wisest, or funniest in all the others. Those are the golden sessions, when 4 or 5 of us, after a hard day's walking, have come to our inn, when our slippers are on, our feet spread out towards the blaze, and our drinks at our elbows, when the whole world, and something beyond the world, opens itself to our minds as we talk, and an affection, mellowed by the years, enfolds us. Life, he says, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? Well, the gratitude and the debt that these men owe to each other is incalculable, especially the relationship between Tolkien and Lewis. Both of these authors were deeply unsatisfied with the stuff that's being written, the fiction, in the post-war years. So gloomy, so cynical. And so they challenged each other one afternoon to do something about it. If they won't write the kind of books we want to write, Lewis says to Tolkien, we shall have to write them ourselves. And that's what they do. Tolkien begins to work seriously on his sequel to The Hobbit. Lewis writes Out of the Silent Planet, the first of the space trilogy. But the fruit of their relationship, it's much richer than this. It's Tolkien's conversation with C.S. Lewis on the night of September 19th, 1931. They talk until 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't usually recommend for my students or others to have conversations till 3 o'clock in the morning. This was a good one. This was a good one. Lewis is not a Christian yet. He's moving there, but he's still hung up on doctrines and issues. And they talk until 3, and Tolkien helps him to understand Christianity as the myth that became fact. The myth that became fact. That conversation Lewis describes as the immediate human cause of his conversion to Christ. Tolkien helps to unlock a door into Lewis's mind, and truth and light flood in. Well, for his part, Lewis becomes for Tolkien his great advocate for pursuing his hobbitry, as they called it, his hobbitry. As Tolkien put it, Lewis's gift to him was his, quote, sheer encouragement over many years to keep on. Listen to Tolkien. He, C.S. Lewis, he was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought the Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. No C.S. Lewis, no Lord of the Rings. How do you like them apples? Well, when Lewis learns that the Lord of the Rings has been accepted for publication, 1950s, Lewis gets the word from Tolkien. They're going to publish it. He writes a letter to Tolkien, one of those other discoveries that just blew me away, describing the sheer pleasure now of looking forward to having the book to read and to reread. And then Lewis reveals the importance of the book, The Lord of the Rings, to both their lives. This is a piece of what he says in the letter. So much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war So much that seemed to be slipping away into the past is now, in a sort, made permanent. Do you see what he's saying? Somehow, Tolkien has captured something of their life's journey together, with all of its struggles, all of its joys, and it's hidden, friends. It's hidden in the pages of this great work. Here is a glimpse of what friendship can look like when it reaches for a high purpose and it's watered by the streams of sacrifice, loyalty, and love. And yet this friendship and creativity and beauty, well, they emerge from the catastrophe of war. The last soldier to die in the Great War was an American, 23-year-old Henry Gunther, a private with the American Expeditionary Force in France. He's killed at 10:59 a.m., November 11th, 1918, 1 minute before the armistice goes into effect. Gunther's squad had encountered a roadblock of German machine guns near the village of Chaumont-d'Avillé. And against the orders of his sergeant, he charges the guns with his bayonet. German soldiers, aware of the armistice, try to wave him off. But Gunther keeps coming, and he's gunned down, and he dies instantly. His divisional record puts it this way: almost as he fell, the gunfire died away, and an appalling silence prevailed. Well, despite the celebrations, the parties, the parades marking the end of the First World War, a brutal and appalling silence fell over much of the world. It was the stillness of souls, anguished, bewildered by the carnage of the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Historian Paul Johnson has called the conflict, quote, the primal tragedy of modern world civilization. The main reason why the 20th century turned into such a disastrous epic for mankind. Winston Churchill, who fought in that war, described it this way: injuries were wrought to the structure of human society which a century will not wipe away, and which may conceivably prove fatal to the present civilization. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis lived through this disastrous time. They endured its many injuries. Their lives are bracketed by war. Were they simply trying to escape the grim realities of the 20th century with their fantasy? It's true, these authors clothe their stories in fantasy and myth. Why? Why? Maybe they do this in order to remind us of certain facts about ourselves, the darkness of human nature, as well as the capacity for virtue and selfless sacrifice. Narnia and Middle-earth are the setting for great conflicts and great quests. Here are war stories wrapped in fantasy, which reveal truths about the human condition. Tolkien and Lewis use the language of myth not to escape the world, but to suggest that real life has a mythic and heroic quality. And so their characters, they make a claim on us, don't they? They make a claim on us. They challenge us to join with them in their struggle against evil. What C.S. Lewis wrote in his review of Tolkien's story when it came out, it applies equally to Lewis's work. Here's what he wrote. As we read, we find ourselves sharing their burden. When we finished, we return to our own life, not relaxed, but fortified. Fortified. War, friendship, imagination. And yet, even this is not the whole of their achievement as we bring this to a close. This brings us to maybe the most surprising element of their story. In the worlds created by Tolkien and Lewis, this struggle against darkness is possible only because there's a source of grace and goodness outside of ourselves. You remember by the end of his quest, Frodo and Sam, Frodo the ring bearer, he's given up the thought of ultimate success or even survival. Hope fails and end comes, he tells Sam. We have only a little time to wait now. We're lost in ruin and downfall, and there's no escape. At the climax of his journey, at the fires of Mount Doom, despite all of his courage and strength, Frodo fails in his quest. He fails. He chooses not to destroy the ring, but instead he succumbs to its power and places it once again on his finger. Remember what Frodo says? I do not choose now to do what I came to do. The ring is mine. The hero cannot, by his own efforts, prevail in the fight against evil. The forces arrayed against him, as well as the darkness within him, make victory impossible. And now the mythic dimension of their stories reaches its zenith. Like the best fairy tales, they provide the consolation of the happy ending. The sudden, joyous turn, as Tolkien put it, toward rescue and redemption. It's the reversal of a catastrophe, what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophe, a decisive act of grace which promises to overcome our guilt, restore what's been lost, and set things right. So Frodo's defeat, which is really our defeat, it's overturned by a power stronger than our weakness. Tolkien identifies this power as, quote, that one ever-present person with a capital P who is never absent and never named. And so it's Gollum, driven by his lust to dominate. He bites off Frodo's finger that bears the ring, slips to his death into the fire. So the ring's destroyed, but not by Frodo. Not by the Fellowship, but by a sudden and miraculous grace. Well, in Lewis's Narnia, that crowning moment of grace occurs in the last battle, right? As King Tyrion, the children, and a faithful remnant of Narnians fight their way to the entrance of the stable, the last battle of the last king of Narnia. Spoil alert. You all know the ending. We are led to believe that inside the stable is certain death, the stronghold of an all-powerful evil. I feel in my bones, says Pagan, that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. I can think of 100 deaths I would rather have died. As the company is forced inside its doors, all hope seems lost. Here again comes the joyous turn. The great lion has invaded the stable, cast out the demon Tash, and turned the stable into a portal to Aslan's country. So for these two giants of literature, there's only one truth, friends. One singular event that can end the long war against evil, undo the tragedy of the human condition, and bring lasting peace. What is it? It's the return of the king. It's the return of the king. In Narnia, of course, that king is Aslan, the great lion, the Christ figure. Only Aslan knows that way to the blessed realm that lies beyond the sea. Listen to Lewis. The light ahead was growing stronger, he writes in the last battle. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase. And then she forgot everything else because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. This king comes in power and beauty as the voice of conscience and the source of consolation, as the lion and the lamb. Here is the union of tenderness and severity, of terror and comfort intertwined. In Tolkien's story, the king is Aragorn, the chief epic hero of the Lord of the Rings. Aragorn, heir to the kingship of Gondor. His life is devoted to the war against Sauron. His true stature is made known, however, only after Sauron's defeat, right? When he finally assumes his throne. Listen to how Tolkien describes that moment of recognition of Aragorn's kingship. But when Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, "Behold the king." Here is a vision, friends, of what human life can look like. A vision of human life that is at once terrifying and sublime. Here is a world, our world, in which every soul is caught up in an epic struggle against evil. A story of sacrifice and courage and clashing armies. The return of the king. It's in these works of fiction, these mythic tales of loss and recovery, of betrayal and redemption, that we find a clue, I think, a clue to the meaning of our earthly journey. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Asked Sam. For the creators of Narnia and Middle-earth, this is the deepest source of hope for the human story. The belief that God and goodness are the ultimate realities, that the shadow of sin and suffering will finally be lifted from our lives. The great war will be won. This king, who brings strength and healing in his hands, will make everything sad come untrue. Thanks for listening. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
So let's, as you're going, by the way, there are copies of the book.
I'm going to show the trailer. I'm going to show film the trailer right
Okay.
now. Can I do that? Can I do that?
Sure.
Before I leave?
Yeah, there are a few leaving, though, so
Okay. Oh, yeah.
if you do want a copy, get it.
Great, thanks.
You want to show the trailer right now?
Right now, yeah. Can we
Okay.
do it now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, guys. I've been working on a film project based on the book. 5-part documentary series, and you're all invited to be stars. Just kidding. Sorry. Who knows? We could use some extras in the trenches in France, maybe. Anyway, we're working on this film. I'm going to show you a 4.5 minute trailer right now. And yet, I'm going to set it up right now. But before I do that, I have one other moment of gratitude. This young man, 22 years old, Michele Loconte, my grandfather. My dad's dad, living in the United States. When the war breaks out, sending money back home to the Italian family. Around 1916, 17, the Italians on the Allied side say, of course, come fight for the Italians. You're an Italian. The Americans say, fight for us, and if you live, we'll make you a citizen. I don't know how long Grandpa thought about that. He fought for the Americans. And he went into battle in 1918, Belgium, France, the Meuse-Argonne, one of the bloodiest battles the Americans fought, I think the bloodiest. He survived, settled in Brooklyn, married, raised a family, and here we are. How about a round of applause for Grandpa Loconte? Yeah. Okay. On to the trailer. You'll see a line of the trailer that says film series starts November 11th of this year. It's not starting this year. We're still raising money. So if you want to go to the website to see the trailer, though, hobbitwardrobe.com, and here we go.
Near the center of every great story is a great conflict, a great war. 2 soldiers, each with a gift for storytelling, survive the storm and steel of the greatest war the world had ever seen. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Together, they used their imagination to battle the darkest forces of their age. A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
The generation of Tolkien and Lewis endured unspeakable loss in a war that they believed would advance the cause of humanity, the war to end all wars. Instead, the funeral of a great myth is about to begin.
And the rise of technology opens a window into the human heart. We're so clever. Look at all these wonderful scientific inventions we have. And what do we use them for? Destroying each other.
When war came, they thought it would be over very quickly. They had no idea that it would turn out to be the worst conflict up to that time in human history.
The tanks, the mortars, the machine guns. No soldier who fought in this war could ever forget the terrors of combat. Tolkien and Lewis will remember them well.
One gets a good sense, I think, from both authors of the frightening quality of battle and the smallness the individual feels.
The essential thing that turned the modern world into what it is was the trauma of the First World War. And of course, both men were right at the heart of it.
And yet, out of the ashes of that conflict, a friendship emerged here, amid the dreaming spires of Oxford.
The friendship between Lewis and Tolkien is really one of the literary masterpieces of all time.
They simply didn't buy into the idea that there's an inevitable progression of humanity upwards into wider and greater knowledge, and that whatever is new is better and truer. They thought that was patently absurd.
How could they actually grapple with their experiences or come to terms with what they had seen? And they were using mythology as a way of doing that.
Tolkien and Lewis had a profound influence on each other. Remember, Lewis went into the war as an atheist, and he came out as an atheist. Without the presence of Tolkien in his life, he might never have shaken off his existential angst and produced works alive with the themes of faith, hope, and joy. For his part, Tolkien once admitted that were it not for Lewis's great encouragement, he never would have brought to a conclusion his epic trilogy. He needed Lewis's constant prodding and demands for more.
You know what Jack Lewis was like. He was such a boy. He had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet.
Imagine a world without The Lord of the Rings and without the Chronicles of Narnia. If it wasn't for the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, we would have neither.
Lewis said, well, since children are going to grow up in a world of dragons and giants, let us at least show the children that dragons and giants can be overcome.
The key character that emerges from Lord of the Rings is Samwise Gamgee. He is the hobbit that is just the normal person. He's a gardener. But at the end of the day, he achieves the final quest. And Tolkien sees him as the epitome of the average British soldier.
True heroism is hobbit-sized. It's in the everyday heroism of somebody who says, I don't know the way.
The hobbit is the small character who is sort of overlooked by all the great ones of the world, but it's on the hobbit's obedience and courage and endurance that Middle-earth is saved. Likewise, Lucy saves the day in Prince Caspian. So you don't have to be, the strong man. You don't have to be, armed to the teeth. You just need to do your duty.
Tolkien and Lewis are casting a vision for a better world and inviting us to be caught up in it.
They saw not an irrelevant other world in which you could escape, but curious enough, exactly the diagnostic tool that they needed to critique the world that they were in. And they did so to devastating effect.
They are fundamental texts. They're incredibly important introductions to some of the most profound questions that Western civilization has raised about the human condition. If we lose the ability to communicate the value of these books to the next generation, then I shall fear for our civilization.
Their great hope was to re-enchant the world through Christian faith and pagan beauty. In many ways, against all expectations, that's exactly what they did.
A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
In a long time, that little shot of me in the pub there, the eagle and the child drinking a beer. We had to get there early before the crowd got in, so that's a 7 o'clock in the morning pint of beer. It's all for Jesus, guys, all for Jesus. It was great, it was great. So I think we got some time for Q&A. We got a little time.
Did you know my room, when I was a student there, was 20 feet behind that room in the Eagle and the Child?
Oh, I'm so jealous.
For a whole year, yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it was pretty fun.
Okay.
Okay, just a little time for questions. Anybody got a question? Take maybe about 5 minutes. We know it's late, but stand up and say it. Over there? No? You're stretching. Anybody?
You're stretching. Floor's open. Floor's open.
Getting ready for bed.
Floor's open. It's okay if you don't. It's okay if you don't.
Back in the corner. Yes, real loud.
Wow, that's a great question. What question would I ask Tolkien? I have never been asked that question, man. Let me think about that. Holy crow. What would I ask those guys? Holy crow. Man, I think what I might ask them is, given, if we could transport them into our world. Can you give me that? Yeah? Okay. If we could transport them into our world, I would ask them, what do we need to hear right now from your work, from your understanding of life and the faith and the struggle, the darkness, but the hope? What do we need to hear now in our time from your stories? I think that's what I might ask him. Great question.
Great question, yeah. Anybody else? Going once. Going twice. There.
I should have spent another year on it, but I was trying to catch this centennial sort of event, so I spent about 6 months on the first draft and then worked it over for another couple of months. It was literally 8 or 9 months to get it done. Grace of God, grace of God. And it's got some errors that need correction, so we know all that. But yeah, sometimes don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right.
Go ahead, stand up.
Well, Tolkien severely resisted that, didn't he? The allegory. And I'm not a professor of literature, so I can't really answer it. He just insists that it's not. I think what Tolkien is doing, on the one hand, yes, he's drawing from the stuff of real life, some of the battle scenes, the approaches to the marshes, there at marshes in Mordor and all. He's drawing from his real memories. So there's a realism to the thing, but he's also steeped in these great epic stories, isn't he? Beowulf, the death of Arthur, all of that, the Aeneid. So I don't know how to answer the question. I'm going to take Tolkien at his word and say it's not an allegory, and he's trying to tell us something. He's trying to take that mythic idea of the hero and reinvent him for the modern mind. I'm going to leave him at that. Great question, though. Thanks.
Okay, I think we ought to call it a night. Joseph Loconte, let's thank him for being here.
Thanks so much, guys. Great to be with you. Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that crowd and that audience. Amazing. Oh, man.